Hi, Mark.
Hi, Tony.
The last of four talks or discussions on faith, hope, and love as ways of knowing, as rather than as moral categories, and probably ways of knowing that I think open up promising new doorways for discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple? And I've certainly found it provocative. I think that these categories give us the beginning of a new language or discourse. I mean, if I think practically about faith, hope, and love, that's one practical way it'll work. The language of faith, the language of hope, and the language of love. Anyway, our last lecture is a little bit of a exploration. It's just a so what. So how might this work in practice? And I think you have made the point throughout these talks that these are not just religious terms. These are terms that are very want to colonize the whole of life. And I'm sure if we had time, you would be well able to say how this language began to change the world, the Western world. I mean, I've just been reading part of a book which you may or may not know, I presume you do, Inventing the Individual by Larry Siedentop.
No, I don't.
The Origins of Western Liberalism. And anyway, it's very much, I don't think the man's a believer, but it's very, very much what you and Edwin have advocated. For instance, his fourth chapter is called "The World Turned Upside Down, Paul."
Right.
So what I'd like us to do is just to discuss examples of how this could work. I would like to begin with the so-called secular world. In other words, these terms aren't religious terms. They're actually terms that work in science, in business, in life. And I'm doing that, partly because I am really intrigued, as you know, by Bonhoeffer's letters from prison, where he was searching for a religionless Christianity and a Christ who was the Lord of life. I'm paraphrasing it, but I think what he was meaning is a lordship that didn't just evidence itself in the problem-solving task of getting rid of sin, but which arguably is a at the edges task. I mean, people would be traditional evangelical or traditional Christians might be offended by that, but that's what he said. He was trying to chart out this area of just Monday to Friday, Monday to Saturday, Sunday, just all of life. How is he Lord of all of life? So I think faith, hope, and love give us a bit of an avenue into that. So I don't know whether you have had any thoughts of examples of the way faith, hope, and love actually are elements of truth finding in all of life. Whether you want to kick off with some examples.
Yeah, look, a couple of things I'd say up front is that when I think of my own practice, and like you, we've spent a lot of our lives in professional contexts trying to help people understand their own context and their own challenges, and and always in really big picture terms. And it's been our lot to grapple with big social technical systems, major systems. The way taxation is structured in a country, the way a mining group handles health and safety across all of its operations, and all kinds of things like that. And it's not that I find myself all the time saying, what does faith mean here? What does hope mean here? What does love mean here? I think in practice, what it's meant for me is a kind of a disposition that probably expresses itself in a couple of things really strongly that are just always there working for me. When I drill into them, I go, yeah, of course, that's what faith, hope, and love looks like. So one of those, the two big ones I think that go hand in hand for me, one is a deep regard for the other, and a sense that, in a little phrase that a client and who became a dear friend of mine used to say, always think about the on behalf of. You know, in everything you do, there is an on behalf of. I remember him telling me in one particular occasion, he was the Deputy Director General of one of the big education departments here in Australia. And he was talking about being in an executive group where they're about to bring some big IT change across the whole organization. And he was a guy, just, you know, he loved the kids. He was the state's youngest ever principal and all that kind of stuff, and had done lots of amazing things. And and he just drilled these guys by saying, look, I know it's a long bow to draw. I don't want to be facile about it, but ultimately introducing this system, how is it ultimately on behalf of the children? You know, and again, he said, I don't want to be facile, but show me how this would change life for a principal, such that the principal was able to change life for his or her staff, such that it means things are possible in the classroom that might not have been possible before. How is it ultimately on behalf of the kids? And it's instructive that he, of course, was met with this sense of incredulity of, you know, we're talking about an IT system here. What do you mean, you know? And as if he's being naive, you know, in the quest, where he just kept pushing back and saying, no, if this is ultimately to change the way that we engage with this whole system, remember that the system exists on behalf of the children, not on behalf of us. And it's this deep sense of, at any given point, saying, what is the point of what I'm involved in here? And what is the point of our labours, of our industry? And it's, you know, and the best of us shines when we think of the other, you know, that we're here on behalf of the other. But the thing that goes hand in hand with this for me is curiosity. It's a curiosity in the other person, but it's also a curiosity more broadly in the world, so that, you know, you and I know, in the work that we did, we'd find ourselves both curious about the people and wanting to know them as other than client, wanting to know them as you know, living, breathing human beings with whom you can have a drink, you know, have a meal and go for a walk, but also curious about the worlds in which they operated. And for you and I, always a sense that particularly the bureaucratic explanations or the political explanations of their worlds and their contexts were never satisfying to us. And we always had the sense that there is more to their worlds, and that more, which kind of lurks in the very human places, that has the potential to bring insight that could change the whole, if only somebody would pay attention to it. Yeah. And my sense is that's, for me, that emerges out of this deep sense of faith, hope, and love. This sense that wherever I go, you know, I stand on the shoulders of other people. There's a desire, where there's a need for faithfulness, which is where truth comes into it. A faithfulness in the way that we represent, a faithfulness in the way that we listen to story. Story, of course, is huge in all of this. I think that, and so is the asking of questions. I think that faith, hope, and love, for me, dispose me not to being disinterested in answers. Obviously, you want answers, but fundamentally to valuing the question almost more than the answer, because the question, the asking of great questions, means that I'm actually going to engage.
Yes.
You know? Yeah. So yeah. I think that's the way it's kind of translated for me. And as you and I have found, and we, even to this day, and now I'm involved in something at the moment, working with one of the big health systems out here. It's only a very small involvement, but I just see over and over again this kind of truncated, reduced way of looking at the world, which is fundamentally self-serving, even from really, they're good people. I don't mean to critique the people, but they've just inherited these ways of thinking that just keep cutting the corners, cutting the rough edges off everything. Whereas our disposition is to say, I want to inquire. There are stories here that I want to be faithful to. I want to understand them. I have the sense that satisfying the requirements of a system is never enough, not only to just keep going and act well, but in fact, it never gives you enough insight, never gives you enough understanding of how the world really is. And whereas, there has to be a sense of hope that this is on behalf of people, such that their experiences, such that their lives can be different. And of course, as Paul says, love is the greatest of all. And it's love. It's that fundamental disposition towards the other that makes that whole thing work. And again, it's not. You could look at that and say, well, aren't they just kind of virtues in the sense of, if I really reduce it, kind of ways of being nice? Whereas I would say no, they're fundamentally. They're ways of inquiry. They're ways of actually engaging. Yeah.
I think that, when you were talking the whole time, I was thinking the big word over this is love.
Yeah.
And that we have tended to objectify reality. As if it's out there and it's a construct, it's a mechanical construct. And so, for instance, the traditional way of doing strategy would be through spreadsheets, operating expenses, increasing revenues, very objectified, arm's length. And the discourse of organizational life is very, very dispassionate and at arm's length. It's quote unquote factual. Whereas what you're talking about is a paradigm shift, not just in attitude, but in saying, no, every human system has a fabric of love in it if it's a good one.
Yeah.
And you take the fabric of love out of it, and it's actually some kind of reduction of reality.
Yeah.
So your headmaster who said on behalf, it's not an IT system, that's actually part of a fabric of reality that's got to be have love wrapped around about. Tell me about the love. Now, he didn't use those words.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's what he meant. And then I think the idea of it's a love for others, I also feel it's a love for God.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like a reverence before gift. That, if I'm a teacher, as he's been a teacher, he would have a reverence for this gift of learning. He would see that as a wondrous thing. Now, the interesting thing about this man, who I don't know, is that there's a sort of a instinct amongst us Christians. It's a nasty little thing to ask, was this man a Christian or not?
Yeah.
And if he's
not going to answer the question,
I don't the question because I know I'm going to say it is a sort of a tribal little inside outside. Whereas, and I think what I'm about to say will help people. We're not talking about Christians, we're talking about the gospel, and which is a wide truth shared by common grace with all. And so it's a discourse that everybody has some access to, and a lot of people who don't yet name the name of Christ have access to. I think the difference we have is being able to name it and structure it, and thus almost reinforce it in people, such as your client. So I think that love, another way of putting it would be, that he put human beings at the center of the system. Then I think your point about curiosity, again, I think you put a spin on that, which is a love spin. The asking of questions unlocks great ideas, but you've talked about a particular way of asking questions.
Yeah.
I like Socrates in many ways, but I don't think he necessarily loved people on the other end. I thought it was a surgical.
We only know Socrates through Plato's eyes, obviously, but in my sense, whenever I read the dialogues, it's like, it's not really an open-ended questioning. He knows where he wants to get this person. In fact, he's skillfully maneuvering this person into a corner.
He's very much so.
That's his kind of questioning, and that's not the kind of questioning that you and I have spent our lives trying to understand and figure out how to practice.
This questioning comes out of a love for people. I really respect you. I respect who you are. I don't know who you are. I'm curious, and that opens things up. And
there's the twin of that is a sense of humility. Is that no matter who you are, I can learn from you. Which is fundamentally an openness to life. That's why I always say that humility is the prerequisite of learning. It's a prerequisite of knowledge, and it's a twin with the idea of faith, hope, and love. It's standing there and saying, I didn't make the world. I'm not the master of the world. I'm not the one holding all knowledge together and making it work. Isn't that wonderful? That means I'm open to learn. And I can learn from anywhere and from anyone. And it means also then that, whenever you walk into a context, you go, look, I respect those who are going to explain to me how this thing actually works, but I know there's always more than what they can see, and always more than what I can see. Yes. And that's why, the instinct to go, I want to go and find the stories. I want to go and find the people, because, as you listen to their experiences, you start to get a larger sense, even in the most kind of, down home, folky, anecdotal stuff, that seemingly you hear from people, as you and I have experienced many times, working on trying to bring about a shift in the experience people have within a system, is you hear these stories. And as long as you're open to them, as long as you're open to valuing the person, they always yield insight, every single one of them. That is, to go back to the big word, knowledge. They help you to know in a way that you would never have known without it.
Yes. And in my latter few years of consulting, we had a fair amount to do with Japan.
Yeah.
And helped some Japanese consultants think in what we call a second roadway. They identified that as human-centeredness.
Yeah.
And they identified that as a massive challenge to the traditional Japanese management culture, putting human beings and reality at the center of things. But because they were trying to understand the methodologies that I was using, they brought a fresh light to them.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I began to realize, as you and I know, when we had what we called a strategic conversation, and we might have 10 or 12 executives in a room, we would interview everybody beforehand. And those interviews were invariably got personal.
Yeah.
They invariably got personal. People start to talk out of some degree of passion. And the flip side of passion can often be anger, because they're irritated by bureaucracy. They're irritated by a sense of being constrained from the possibilities of what the organization could do. And when you got to that passion, you're getting, in my word, to love. Now, it's a different kind of love. I'm talking now not so much about a love for people, but a love for mission. The best of people loved the organization for its mission.
Yeah.
And for instance, if it was an engineering company, they loved engineering and they loved what would be possible in that. When you found that, you began to get, that was the material out of which you could build a real strategy. And as you know, in our model of the ABCD model, B is the vision part, and the vision, when a lot of consultants talk about vision, they objectify this as increasing revenue by 15% or some kind of numerical goal. It leaves everybody cold. The people, the great strategic conversations, the great strategies, the great vision, I've often thought the best word to put over the B space, which is vision, is love. What do you love? Tell me what you would really love. And people do not need, people who are any good do not need very much provocation to answer that question. They might need some structure to explore it. And I can remember that I was, for instance, doing a strategic conversation in New York with one of the world's largest banks. I won't mention who they are. And this group, their situation was that over the last 5 years, they had, under a previous leader, pretty well rescued from bankruptcy, this division. And so in a way, they were, sitting on triumph, and the new leader's question was, well, why would we want to do anything different? Have you got any passion left in you? And now the conversation didn't break open by any kind of objectified facts, objectified analysis, because any objectification of facts would have said to these people, just keep going. But the question that broke it open was, if this is all you did, would you be disappointed? What would you love to actually be part of over the next 5 years? And that was what broke open the imagination. And so I think now, what we're saying here is that loving things, loving people, loving things is a critical aspect. It's not some kind of icing on the cake to where the heart of truth finding is factual, and you put a kind of a social icing on the cake to make everybody happy. It's not like that at all. The love, it drives the inquiry, and the love is an integral part of the cognitive process of shaping possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the B in ABCD, where do we wish to be, is the whole manner in which in fact, I was just thinking we could quite easily go through the 4 places and talk about each of those in terms of faith, hope, and love. It's your brilliance that came up with this model, and your thesis that explored it all. But drawing on Aristotle's insight, they are places of thought. They are topoi, from which we get our word both topic and topos, as in topography. And they require a different kind of mode of inquiry. And yet, interestingly, faith, hope, and love, you could write those across all those quite different modes of inquiry. They are still manifestations of faith, hope, and love. So if I do that really quickly off the cuff, if you think in terms of the exploration of current reality, I've often liked to think of it as what we are after is insight, not a list of problems, and we've all seen, groups that go away for, their strategy retreat or whatever it is, and they go into small groups and they get the butcher's paper things all around the walls, and it's a list of every problem they can think of. And if you ask anybody, what did last year's butcher's paper sheets look like, and the year before and the year before, and anyone who's been there long enough will say, well, basically they're the same. And likewise, when we come to talk about what we prefer, we can only talk about B as the absence of A. If you can solve all today's problems, well, nirvana, that's a better world. And yet something in you cringes at that point, and what I've, long said to people is, look, we're not after a list of problems. We're after genuine insight. What is it about the current reality that makes you either somewhere between feeling ashamed or a sense of loss, a sense of falling short, and at the same time, what is there that arouses in you desire? That we're better than this. Our own stories tell us a lot of great things, but we've never quite known what to do with it. So we're trying to draw that out of people, which is, in a sense, is to say, what do you believe? And where is hope crushed? Where is the manner in which we are being? Where does it fall short of the love? Again, you and I don't use those actual words when we're working with people, but I'm saying that's where it comes from. Where is the love for customer, for client, for patient, for community, for whatever group it is? That there's a sense of, maybe shame is too strong a word, but a sense of we fall short of what it is we long to be able to provide.
That's a completely different way of diagnosing current reality than problem.
Absolutely.
Because you're actually not looking at problems, you're looking at frustrated purpose. Where is your love frustrated? Totally different discourse. Whilst they are confessing in that discourse issues that are frustrating and challenging, there's also the this early energy towards possibilities.
Yeah, it's why you and I have always been drawn towards the cynic as well, and in organisations, and we've seen so many managers basically steering us away from the cynic. We don't want them involved in the group and whatever else, and yet our sense is always that cynicism. I know it can be very, very black and very ugly, but often there's a kind of sense of repressed love, of a person who desires for something far, far better, but does not know how to live with the frustration surrounding that, and so they turn inward and bitter. But as we've experienced so many times, you sit with a person like this long enough for them to realize that you are not sitting in judgment on them, that you're genuinely curious in who they are as a person. And you start to hear this other stuff.
As you say that, I mean, I have one shining example that we did in one of, which was the major government-owned road insurance agency in one of the big regions in Australia. So really, really multi-billion-dollar government-funded insurance company for accident claims. Anyway, we were warned about this guy who'd been there like 25 years and knew the place like the back of his hand and hated consultants, and they were very frightened to have a strategic conversation with 25 people in the room if he was there too, because he would just throw hand grenades in. Well, lo and behold, of course, this is the guy who had the greatest love for the organization and the greatest anger. Yeah. And because the process was being framed in these terms of, well, what do you love? What would you love to do? He absolutely took to it like a duck to water, because he could tell his story. He could not just bitch about all the irritations, but talk about what's possible. And in the terminology we're using, he was able to tell the truth, quote unquote, because he was able to have a discourse of what do you love, what do you believe in this organization.
This, when I did the TED talk on grounded questions in Geneva, whenever it was, 2014 or something, what I was trying to get at in that was that, I've seen a way of asking questions that just closes everything down. It sounds all very grown up and sophisticated. Like, for example, asking, what is best practice culture? And I tell the story in the TED talk, or I tell a few stories, but one of them about, one of my clients who was the head of a huge infrastructure group, and they acquired some other groups. he had a sense of, we need to find some cohesion here in how people are going to work. And inevitably, it had the consultants come in. And so they start talking in terms of what's best practice culture, and which derives from some article somewhere or something someone did in Scandinavia, and instead I asked him the question, said, indulge me, of whom are you proud? And he was initially like, would you please stay on track here, Mark? What are you asking me such a stupid question for? I said, no, just indulge me. Of whom are you proud? And of course, the only way to answer that is to tell a story. And he told this great story about a group of people. I think from memory, they were actually building railways. And it was men and women down at the rail face, doing this stuff. And he loved them, and loved what they did. And I said, would you like to see more people working like that? He said, well, of course, that's the whole point of the exercise. And I said, is there another story? And, and he tells me 10 or 12 stories, and they're all across the organization, and they're wonderful stories. And you can just hear his pride, which, AKA his love, for these people and what they do. And so I said to him, look at these slides. The consultants had produced these 50 odd PowerPoint slides, with all the usual stuff, mission, visions, values, blah, blah, blah. And I said to him, do these slides look like the people in the stories you just told me? Or vice versa, do the people in the stories, the way in which they think and they act and they talk with each other and the way they go about their work, the way they what value means to them, does it actually look anything like what you've got in these slides? And of course, the answer was no. And so I said, well, I think you need to be, think seriously about what you're about to do to people, because you're about to go out to people in effect and say, well, that's all very well, all these lovely things in these stories, but we want you all to talk like this and look like this. And of course, it's an aberration. And I said to him, you'll get one of two responses. The people who are robust in themselves, who are confident, they will, sit through your 50 PowerPoint slide presentation when it finally gets cascaded down to them. And they'll basically say, point 3 on slide 17, we like that. That's really helpful. Thank you. We'll take that and we'll add it to what we do. The rest of it, we really don't know what to do with any of that. And so we'll just ignore it, and according to those who run the process, of course, that's a terrible thing, but in reality, it will actually lead them to continue to do the very thing for which they are so highly regarded. Whereas people who lack that sort of robustness and a sense of confidence in who they are, they will feel like, oh, we have to do everything that's in these slides. And as they do that, they actually start to lose what it is that's actually precious to them. And and you and I have seen this so many times with school teachers, for example, who are in, tough circumstances, and someone comes out with the next, professional development program, and people go away saying, oh my goodness, I've got to do this and this and this and this as well, rather than be able to stand back and go, wait a minute, fundamentally, I'm here for the children, and what is it that I've just heard that helps me see the children with fresh eyes? What is it that helps me see the craft with fresh eyes? And that's why, I tell the story at the end of the talk about the school that I worked with. It was really, really tough. And instead of asking, what's wrong, how do we fix it, which is the questions that we've been hardwired into us, which just eradicate any conversation that has a skerrick of faith, hope, and love about it. Instead, we ask the question, why did you become a teacher? Mm. And they tell these wonderful, wonderful stories, including the teachers that people had a pretty poor opinion of. And what happens then is a different kind of dialogue started to happen between these teachers, and you and I know one little session like that's not going to change everything. But fundamentally, it's that I think what we bring to people so deeply embedded in faith, hope, and love is a gift to people in these contexts where, they've been taught that to be grown up and professional and sophisticated is in fact to have a really truncated view of life and of each other.
Well, look, the practicality of these intangibles, these ways of looking at the world, is something that I think very unusual. I mean, we've had the privilege of seeing this work in practice. As you were talking, I was thinking about one of the most intractable strategic conversations I had to manage years ago with a major government department. And what had happened was that department it was an industrial relations problem, massive industrial relations problem. And every 5 years, the executives had to come out with new salary offers. They came out with new salary offers. They were by any measure generous, but there was a vote against. They were voted down by the staff, and they were voted down by the staff really as a opportunity to put to put a vote of no confidence in the man, just to complain.
Yeah.
So this then led the entire executive of the organisation for 6 months to have to reorganise themselves and go out and try to win over the staff. It was a terrible distraction, and it was an intractable, wicked problem. Yeah. The guy who was in charge of the project came to me and said, could we run a strategic conversation about it? And we did, and we got in. Now, what he then did was, he said, and I'm going to get in the antagonists, not just the protagonists.
Yeah.
So senior executive, but he invited the two major unions to come. Now, this was seen to be incredibly risky,
Yeah.
But he was a risk taker. So in the room, we had these people. So the question is, how are we going to get these warring factions together? And it was a very, very, it was a really, really tangible problem with intangible causes.
Yeah.
Look, the breakthrough was we made the vision. We had to get some sort of sense of hope. What are we all hoping for? What's our goal?
Yeah.
And at a low level, their goals were adversarial.
Yeah.
It's management versus staff, and so on. But what we did, which was the breakthrough, was we made the goal our children, who are the workers of the future.
Mm.
And what kind of workplace do we all want to craft for the next generation of workers who we could imagine as our children?
Yeah.
That changed everything.
Absolutely.
That changed everything. And the process became coherent.
Yeah.
And it effectively was the breakthrough, and saved months of time because people got on the same page. Now, the only way to diagnose that is the practicality of introducing love into the discourse. Yeah. And creating an object of that love that's a real person that we can imagine. Yeah. And then saying, how do we structure a system for that person?
And interestingly, faith and hope are there as well. I mean, if you think, in one sense, what you're doing, and I've had the same sort of circumstances, and like you, many times, I've asked that the adversarial groups or the lower down the order groups, are present within the conversations, and there's always resistance to this, and this terrible elitism at work, which is not just, we're superior to those people, but we know better, and we'll have better insights than the people who actually live close to it. But in a sense, to create this picture of, the workforce of the future for their children, there's a sense in which you're asking, what do you really believe, underneath all this? And you find this common ground. We each see, personified in children, we each see the dignity in other human beings. Mm-hmm. It's hard for us to see it in each other at the moment because we're on either sides of an issue. But when we think of our children, we stand side by side and say, do you believe in the dignity of your children? Yes, I do. And I believe the same in mine. And so what's the hope you have? And the hope is that they will live well. Yes. And we share that. So, and as you say, love is the greatest one because, why do I believe these things? Why do I have this hope? Is this deep regard for the other.
Yeah.
And when you find that, I guess the whole tone of what I'm hearing in our conversation this morning is, for a lot of people, these words sound fluffy, and we've had this experience where, without even using the words faith, hope, and love, there are times when just how those animate you and I, and the ways in which we've wanted to conduct the discourse and wanted to conduct the inquiry, where we wanted curiosity to go, where we wanted imagination to go. There are people who kind of resist this, and push back, like somehow this is not sophisticated enough or professional enough or whatever else, doesn't, and yet, our instincts are that it's not going to take you to some place that is fluffy and intellectually lighter. It's actually going to take you deeper. You're going to have to grapple with things intellectually. That is, because you're going to look at a system as a whole, not the parts, and that is always harder. And you're going to have to deal with genuine ambiguity and genuine complexity when you do this. So, you and I, we've had to ride through that moment of, oh, this all sounds a bit folky, and, why are you doing this? Till eventually you get to the point of people going, oh my God, this is harder. This is harder to think through, but it's more rewarding.
It is. And I'd like to pick up, so far, really, we've talked a lot about, I think the dominant word is love, of the three. I would like to just move to another associated field of human endeavor, which is innovation.
Yeah.
And modern corporations are almost incapable of innovation because they want so much proof. And so anyone with an idea or an investment case has to put forward what is called in organizations a business case, which is prove it.
Yeah.
Now, by definition, if I haven't done something, I can't prove it.
Yeah, please prove what does not yet exist.
And I amuse myself by saying, if you took Apple or Amazon, one of these huge startups, and just wound the clock back and threw a business case at Steve Jobs and asked him to prove that he was going to turn Apple into a great corporation, he would have A, been incapable, and B, been scornful.
Or even that people were going to want what he was thinking about.
Yeah, and so he had this irascible, relentless faith, and that is a necessary component in innovation. And I, as you know, am heavily involved in a startup company in big data and advanced analytics. So it's interesting to apply faith, hope, and love to our operating model, which we have. So we've created a human-centered operating model. The company is not a Christian company per se, but I won't go into that. That's a bit complex. But if you look at how do you, now at the moment, if you'd ask me, how successful the company is or will be, the answer is, I don't know. Yeah. But the early investors, the very, very early investors in a company, invest largely on faith.
Yeah.
And all of the investors that I've encouraged to invest, I've said, you've got to roll the dice here. We don't know if this is going to work. You've got to be prepared to lose your money, otherwise you can't invest. Yeah. And the only thing we've got to tell you so far is a story. So here's the story.
Yeah.
And eventually they're investing in a story. Now, the interesting thing is this, Mark, if the whole idea of the story is to turn that story more and more into reality. And the closer to reality it gets, the more expensive it becomes to invest in the company.
Yeah.
So the people who put $1 in and take $10,000 out will be the people who believed right at the beginning.
Yeah.
The people who put $10,000 in and got $12,000 out, there wasn't a lot of faith in it because, frankly, you guys already got customers. It looks pretty good. Yep, I'm pretty certain about it. Yeah. So there's this truth in investment and in innovation that the more faith, the greater the reward.
Yeah.
Now, the faith is not uneducated. No. Because, I had to tell a story and these guys are sophisticated, and I didn't tell the story once, could you talk to me about that bit again? And what if this, but it's still essentially prototyping with words. And so I've looked at that and seen how faith, fed by stories, fed by narrative, faith actually drives human endeavor.
Yeah.
Take faith away and only have proof, and we get nowhere because we can only prove what already exists.
Yeah.
And then the other one is hope, which a lot of people might confuse with faith. I think I see hope very much as a leap of faith. It's almost like in diagnosing human cognition, people sometimes talk about deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. I mean, Charles Peirce, a great philosopher, and William James, the American experiential philosophers in the early part of the 20th century, around the year 1900, they were very big on abduction, which is this strange human ability to almost out of nowhere leap across time, leap across possibilities. Say, I reckon we could do this.
Yeah.
I reckon we could. And I can't, there's no pathway to it, but I reckon we could. So you might call that spark of imagination or whatever. And of course, it becomes extremely difficult to say where on earth these ideas came from. There's definitely a really big God factor in, but this is fundamental to the human condition. This ability to conceptualize what does not exist, and of course, even as I'm saying that, I'm thinking of Abraham. God called into being what didn't exist, and He called it as though it did exist.
Yeah.
And we're made in His image. So these, I've been utterly fascinated by the way faith and hope drive innovation in human activities. And yet, of course, a lot of our systems make that very difficult.
Absolutely. I often think when we talk like this, I often think about science and how science actually develops. And, people will say, science is basically it's the so-called scientific method. That is is the kind of the wellspring, or the driving force of how science develops. But of course it can't. All the so-called scientific method can do is falsify. It can only tell you what does not work, because no matter how many times you say something does work, you still don't know if the next time it won't work. So it's a very, very useful thing when you want to bring, a degree of precision and care over what has already been created. But the ideas, the next thing in science can't occur from there. It's an act of, as you say, it's an act of faith. It's an act of human imagination. It's an extrapolation that is very much along the line of what you were saying. I wonder if, or often, of course, it's a happenstance thing where something happens around them and they look and go, oh my goodness, I wonder then if this and this. That's actually how science, all of science, has actually progressed.
Correct.
And the so-called scientific method only comes in on the back of that as saying, well, we think we now have something. We think we've got a solid idea. Can you break it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, Einstein was a tremendous advocate of the imagination.
Yeah.
I didn't realize until recently that the whole of Gestalt psychology, begun by a couple of German psychologists, they were mates of Einstein. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
And he was, in a way, their prototype. And Gestalt, of course, without going into it now, but it clearly is a way of looking at the big picture and facilitating an act of imagination to fill gaps in the picture. And there's something utterly mysterious as to why you begin to get the idea. It's like a breeding ground for the idea, and there's something mysterious about the birth of the idea, and where faith, hope, and love get a lot closer to explaining cognitively what's going on. And you're right. Once the idea is there, the idea, that's when the scientific method comes in, and you begin to test it and you begin to check it, and that's how the development must continue. In the startup I was talking about, there's an idea. You can't stay with the idea. The idea's got to move,
Yeah.
and it moves. But once the idea is articulated, you can begin to test parts of the idea. Parts of the hypothesis. You can begin to test it. Will the customers really like X? Can I actually build technology Y? But it's iterative. You've then got to go back again and start with the ideas, and so there's this iteration between what we could call hope, imagination, and of course these words are all positive. You don't hope. Hope is not gloom. Hope's always got to be, I bet we could. I bet we could be great. I bet we could do X, Y, and Z. And that leads the way. That leads the way. That is the source of the cognitive activity. So,
I think it's been a really powerful picture of this, I think, in, just a few years back now, in the development of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where over, many years, Indigenous groups, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups here in Australia, and with our friend Dean, heavily involved in all of that, and Noel, ended up producing this remarkable statement, and calling for recognition in the Constitution, and a voice in some way. And as we saw, the very politicians who line up to be photographed with these people and to say the right things, such that we're all very, very positive towards our Indigenous people of Australia. The moment it got down to, will you now do something with this? People started to nitpick around, oh, well, if you're going to do that, it would have to mean this, and I don't think that would work. And, it's just completely out of spirit with what the statement itself is, but also completely out of whack with what you and I know in this broader conversation we've been having about all innovation. And that is, you've got to be able to stand back and look at it and say, I would say from my beliefs is, this was an extraordinary and beautiful statement of the heart, that enshrines faith, hope, and love. It's not sectarian. It's not, it doesn't exclude, and yet, people's first response to this is to go into this bureaucratic kind of mode of thinking that, well, I've got to think about all the problems that I'll inherit now if I'm to take this seriously. Rather than saying, look, as the people who formed the statement were saying themselves, we don't know exactly how this comes into practice. Okay, that has still yet to be worked out. We understand that, we acknowledge that, but we've got to start from some kind of a statement. Some kind of, it's like the promise to Abraham, in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. You can imagine Abraham saying, well, hang on a minute.
How?
I'm just not sure how you're going to do that.
Where's the project plan?
Yeah, exactly. And rather than going, I guess I have to live with this now, and try and understand what on earth it would mean, and understand what on earth it would require of me, what on earth it would require of you, what it would require of the manner in which we are with each other, and how does it lead me to know in a different way? What do you mean all the nations of the earth will be blessed? I mean, Abraham was not alone coming from Ur, that every ancient culture was concerned fundamentally with itself, or with taking over other cultures. What's this radical notion, this strange notion of blessing going to all people of all cultures and all nations? I don't know where to begin with that, but is it, does it come back to faith and hope? Does it, and love? Does it arrest you in some way? Does it, when I look at the Uluru Statement, I just slow down and I pause and I look at it and I want to say, what does it mean for me to regard the people who framed this, and to regard their vision of the world, to regard their faith, their hope, their love, how would we act in such a way that said, we stand with you? And, and
I
faith,
think,
hope, and love will always lead us to do that, I think, to stand with.
well, they will, and I think this does shine a light on the particular advantage the gospel gives to somebody in the situation, because what I keep thinking as you're talking as to what Paul said, be able to give a reason for the hope that is in you.
Yeah.
We of all people have a reason. You see, the problem with hope, in particular, is it's absolutely often irrational. I mean, I've often seen idealism disappointed.
Yeah.
Things are harder than you thought, and the question of perseverance comes in. I'm like, how can I keep on hoping? How can I keep on being an optimist? And how can I keep on being an idealist? The only answer can be, which we can have in our hearts and give, is it's because God is. That's just what you've said, that as you talked about Abraham and God saying to Abraham, in you will all nations of the earth be blessed. That was a vast abductive leap, way beyond Abraham's ability to comprehend in his life. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't draw down on it. He drew down on it, presumably, as did the Jews, as did the Christians. But what we know as we read the narrative is the God's hope clarified, expanded as the generations went through.
Yeah.
And then culminating in Christ, culminating and going beyond Christ, or not so much beyond Christ as beyond the earliest apprehensions of Christ by the disciples. Their apprehension of hope grew and grew and grew.
Yeah.
And so we're not making hope up out of our own resources. We're actually, following in the footsteps of God. We're chasing God when we talk about hope, and we can really declare that. I know you've got to go. I wanted to finish with a story.
Yeah.
Because we've talked a lot about the way faith, hope, and love give a discourse in big systems. And it's a way of, I think, saying, wow, Jesus is Lord of all of life. But I think that I'd just like to finish with a little story which takes us right back to the personal level. I've often thought how language creates realities or breaks down realities.
Yeah.
And soon after we began this Faith, Hope and Love series, I had the occasion to talk to a person, a woman, who I didn't know that well, friend of one of our children, very fine person, who has been abandoned by her husband, and it was not a nice situation. And although this, by any objective assessment, you would have to say this woman was more capable. She was, just a very capable person, and I think much more capable than her husband. Nonetheless, within the discourse, he was very successfully trash talking her. And she couldn't get it because she was vulnerable to some degree of pessimism, and because she was having to hold down a job and raise the kids, and it was corroding her. His language was corroding her. So I spoke to her for a variety of reasons that I won't go into, but it was a long telephone conversation where I explicitly used the faith, hope, and love. I knew what I was doing. And I said, well, look, can I guess what you're feeling when he says X, Y, and Z? You're starting to doubt yourself, aren't you? You're starting to implicate yourself, aren't you? You're starting to say, well, if he's so bad, why did I choose him in the first place? And I tracked down the pessimism in him.
Yeah.
And I then, and when he says X, Y, and Z, you know, you're whatever, angry, you're disorganized, I said, I, 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 I declared that was a lie. I said, that is a deceit, right? You are a wonderful person, and you know you are a person who really cares for others. And all I could say was I spoke the language of hope over her and the language of love, because I very clearly had in my mind what you'd said. If I speak without love, there, even if the facts were correct, even if it was factually correct that on day X you were 10 minutes late to pick the kids up, even if that's factually correct, but I'm saying that to tear you down, I am telling a lie.
Yeah.
I am the voice of deceit, which we know in the Bible is the language of Satan. He's called the slanderer. I think that's how it translates him, the accuser and the slanderer. And I can even take what is quote unquote factually true. You were 10 minutes late for an appointment or whatever. But I'm lying because there's no faith, there's no hope, and there's no love. And so out of that resource of the language of faith, hope, and love, I spoke to her, and I know it was, I needed a very, very strong coordinate to withstand his lies, and it was very effective in helping her. And I think that we need to, you know, keep looking at ourselves for that language, finding that language in ourselves, to declare over people, including children, family, friends, and situations, that it, you know, the language of faith, the language of hope, and the language of love. Well, Mark,
Great, Tony.
it has been great, and I really appreciate the way you think about this. I think, and I think a lot of other people do. I've got some very good feedback from this, and you know, perhaps we might write it up one day. But you know, then again, perhaps we won't. Okay.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.